A watch still ticking after death. What secret does it hide? Welcome to Faded Echoes. I am your host, Ombra. I love seeing this community grow. Tell me where you're tuning in from today. Your comments mean the world to me. Let's begin. You wouldn't think a watch could stir up trouble at the brownstone. Flowers, yes. A woman in tears, sure. But a watch? That's what did it. Though, as usual, Wolfe saw the whole storm blowing in before I'd even opened the window. It started on a Thursday afternoon about the time Fritz was threatening my soul with his sauce reductions if I didn't quit leaning against the kitchen door frame. I'd just informed him that his Béarnaise didn't need divine intervention, only a less nervous wrist when the front bell rang. That bell is like a summons from the fates. You never know whether it's going to bring in a fat retainer, a nuisance, or a copper with a grudge. I opened the door to a man whose face had all three possibilities in it: money, trouble, and suspicion. He was neat, pressed, and unflinching, but there was a tension in his shoulders that told me he'd rehearsed his story all the way up the stoop. He introduced himself as Charles Rayburn, a jeweler with a store off Madison. His voice had the dry polish of a man who'd spent 20 years telling matrons their diamonds were flawless while hiding the appraiser's grin. "Mr. Wolfe," he said after I'd ushered him into the office, "I need your discretion and your intellect." I sat him down and told him he'd need his wallet too, which earned me a look like I'd chipped his favorite ruby. Wolfe was in his chair, mountainously comfortable, eyes half closed, as if contemplating whether the orchids upstairs or the pâté de foie gras cooling in the kitchen were more important to human progress. "Proceed," Wolfe said, with the tone of a Roman emperor indulging a supplicant. Rayburn cleared his throat. "It concerns a watch, an antique timepiece. A customer, an old friend, died last week. Heart failure, sudden, unexpected. His daughter brought me the watch from his estate papers. But the watch, it had been reset, to the exact minute of his death." That got me. I leaned in, because it wasn't the kind of detail you could shrug off. A dead man's watch ticking on the minute of his passing was either poetic coincidence or someone's idea of a nasty joke. Wolfe opened his eyes, gave Rayburn a look sharp enough to peel a grape. "You are disturbed by this?" "Yes," Rayburn said, "because the watch was in my possession that morning. I was servicing it. I returned it hours before his death. And when I examined it yesterday, it was still keeping time, except frozen at the moment he died. As though—" he faltered. "As though someone wanted it to stop exactly then." "Pfui," Wolfe muttered, but not in dismissal. "In interest." He folded his hands over his vest. A gesture of symbolism or of strategy. "You are not a credulous man, Mr. Rayburn. Why come to me? Because the daughter insists her father was murdered, and if that's true, I may be implicated. I'll say this. A jeweler worrying about a timepiece and a murder is a fresh enough angle to get Wolfe off the fence. He didn't move an inch, of course, but his eyelids lowered, which, for him, was the equivalent of leaping to his feet. "Very well," he said. "Mr. Goodwin will obtain the particulars. Your client's name, associates, and enemies. He will fetch the daughter, too. This house will be disturbed, Mr. Rayburn. I permit it. Permit it, like a king granting permission to have his castle invaded. That's Wolfe for you. And just like that, we had a ticking watch, a dead man, and the promise of more trouble than Fritz's Béarnaise could smooth over. I told Rayburn to stay put while I fetched him a glass of water, though between you and me, it was mostly to give Wolfe an extra minute to decide whether he actually wanted this mess dirtying up the parquet. By the time I got back from the kitchen, Wolfe hadn't budged, which in his case meant he'd already set 3 mental chess pieces into motion. Rayburn, though, had leaned forward in his chair, elbows on his knees, and was studying the rug like it might whisper the right words to him. "Archie," Wolfe said, his eyes still closed, "you will go to this daughter immediately. Learn the circumstances of the father's death. names, relationships, what enemies his passing inconvenienced. Above all, inquire into this watch. Who wound it? Who touched it? Who may have reason to plant such a trifle as symbolism? Sure, I said, and if she tells me it was stopped by the hand of fate, should I take dictation or just smile pretty? Rayburn twitched. His hands, steady when he'd given me his card, trembled faintly now, as though the weight of his own story had grown heavier since he'd told it aloud. Her name is Julia Kincaid. She's staying at her father's house on 78th. She'll see you if you tell her I sent you. Will she? I muttered. Lucky me. Wolfe opened one eye. Bring her here, Archie. I will not move from this chair, nor do I propose to waste words on conjecture until she presents herself. If she refuses, employ such persuasion as you deem necessary within the bounds of decency. I want her impressions unfiltered, which meant my night was about to turn into one of those charming excursions where I play ambassador, detective, and social secretary all at once. I gave Rayburn my professional grin, the one that promises nothing and offends nobody, and walked him to the door. His thank you was subdued, almost reluctant, like he wasn't sure if hiring Wolfe was the cure or the contagion. The trip uptown was brisk, traffic cooperating just enough to make me think New York had been bribed. Julia Kincaid's house was the kind that had been handsome 50 years ago and expensive every year since. A grey stone facade, shutters neat enough to suggest someone actually cared, and a front door polished to a shine you could check your tie in. She answered herself, which was surprising. I'd expected a maid, or at least a butler with enough starch in his collar to cut cheese. Julia Kincaid was in her late 20s, tall, poised, but with shadows under her eyes that no amount of pearl earrings could disguise. She looked me over as if she had expected the undertaker, and I had arrived by mistake. I'm Archie Goodwin, I said, offering the kind of smile designed to soften the blow. Charles Rayburn sent me. Nero Wolfe is interested in your father's watch. Her lips tightened, not in disdain, more like she was holding back a dozen words that would scatter if she let one slip. You'd better come in. The interior was hushed, the kind of hush that comes from both money and grief. The living room had enough mahogany to build a small yacht and curtains heavy enough to smother a storm. On the mantel above the fireplace sat a brass clock, ticking faithfully, as if mocking the watch that had stopped. She gestured to a chair, but stayed standing herself, arms crossed. If Rayburn sent you, then he's desperate. He thinks someone will blame him. I leaned back, studying her. Maybe. But Wolfe doesn't care who thinks what. He cares about facts. He wants you at the brownstone. He doesn't like leaving home, and he doesn't like second-hand stories. He'll need to hear yours directly. Her eyes flashed, a sudden spark against the dullness of morning. You think I'm inventing this? That I wanted my father's death to look unnatural? I don't think anything, I said, as evenly as a cop reciting Miranda rights. I deliver messages, and Wolfe delivers conclusions. If you want his help, you'll have to meet him halfway. The silence stretched. Finally, she dropped her arms. My father died sitting right in that chair. She pointed to a high-backed armchair facing the fireplace. The doctors said heart failure. He was healthy, Mr. Goodwin, vigorous, and when I found the watch in his papers, I knew. Someone wanted it to look symbolic. Someone wanted me to wonder. Her voice cracked slightly on that last word, though she fought it back with a lift of her chin. That stubbornness told me Wolfe would like her, or at least not dismiss her outright, which in his world was affection. Then give him the chance, I said gently. Tomorrow afternoon, I'll escort you myself. You can tell Wolfe everything. He won't waste your time. She hesitated, weighing the offer. At last, she nodded, the motion abrupt, like she was signing a contract she couldn't read. Tomorrow. Back at the brownstone, I found Wolfe exactly where I'd left him, as though time for him obeyed different rules than the rest of us. I reported, word for word, Julia's remarks, ending with her agreement to come. Wolfe grunted, a deep rumble of satisfaction. Good. The disruption is inevitable. Better it be orderly. He reached for his beer, the glass catching a glint of lamplight. Archie, note this. Symbols are the refuge of those without reason. Yet to employ one with precision implies calculation. We will see. And that was that. Fritz served squab with mushroom sauce, and Wolfe ate in silence, chewing not only the meat, but the problem. I knew better than to interrupt. The house was quiet, but I had the sense of storm clouds piling up beyond the windows, waiting for the right moment to break. I went to bed that night with the sound of clocks in my head, ticking, keeping time, refusing to stop. One of them had already betrayed its master. The others were just waiting their turn. Morning in the brownstone doesn't begin with the sunrise. It begins with Fritz clattering pans in the kitchen and Wolfe growling for coffee from his room upstairs. By the time the orchids had received their sermon and Wolfe had descended to his chair, I'd already put through a few phone calls to grease the wheels. The jeweler, Rayburn, hadn't returned to his store yet, which I filed as interesting. He had the kind of nerves that made people linger outside their own front door before they went in. Meanwhile, Julia Kincaid was on the hook for a 2:00 visit, which meant I had just enough time to try and line up the picture before she arrived to complicate it. I started with the obvious. Her father, Gregory Kincaid, businessman, semi-retired. He'd made his pile in textiles, which in New York means you either supplied the whole world or you knew which palms to grease. I got a few quick background notes from a friend at the Gazette who owed me more than a sandwich. Kincaid had a reputation for being both exacting and generous, depending on whether you were his partner or his opponent. No whisper of scandal, but plenty of people who might have wished him out of the way for reasons that were less than saintly. When I returned to the office with the first printouts of gossip, Wolfe was already in place, fortified with beer and surrounded by his usual barricade of unread correspondence. He looked at me as if I were a particularly insistent fly. "Well?" he demanded. I gave him the bullet points. Textiles, respectable fortune, no official enemies, a daughter whose grief had enough backbone to make it suspiciously functional. Wolfe listened with the patience of a man who knew the ending to the story and was only tolerating the prologue. "And Rayburn?" he asked. "Hiding, for all I know. He's got enough starch to come here and spin us his tale, but I doubt he's sleeping well with that watch ticking in his head. I'll corner him later if you want." "Not yet," Wolfe murmured. "The jeweler is the conduit. We must first test the current." That was Wolfe's way of saying Julia was the spark, and she'd light the fuse when she stepped through the door. At precisely 2:00, as if a clockmaker himself had arranged it, Julia Kincaid arrived. This time she looked less like a woman greeting death at her doorstep and more like someone who'd accepted a dare she couldn't ignore. Her dress was sober but expensive, her hair tied back and her eyes sharp enough to slice through Fritz's finest roast. Wolfe didn't rise naturally. He gestured to the red leather chair as if it were a throne he was allowing her to borrow. She sat, rigid, and when he spoke, it was the same tone he reserved for the occasional senator or the occasional fool. He didn't care which category she would end up in. "Miss Kincaid," Wolfe began, his voice deliberate, "your father's death is certified as natural, yet you insist it was not. You have nothing tangible save this watch." "Why?" Her lips pressed tight, but she answered evenly. "Because my father kept that watch beside him always. He never let it stop, never forgot to wind it. For it to stop the moment he died, when it had been serviced just that morning, means someone tampered with it." "Phooey," Wolfe said, though softly. "Symbolism." She leaned forward, her composure cracking just a little. "Do you think I want this? That I enjoy believing someone used my father's death as a stage for a trick? I don't. But he told me, 2 days before he died, that he was being pressured, that someone wanted a favor he would not give. He didn't name them, but he was shaken." That sharpened Wolfe's eyes. though his body stayed put. He raised a finger, the closest he came to excitement. "Ah, now we approach substance. You withheld this yesterday." "I wasn't ready to tell you," she admitted. "But I can't pretend it means nothing. Whoever wanted that favor, if they were denied. They might have found a way to make his death look ordinary. But they left the watch as a sign, to mock him, to mock me." I watched Wolfe take it in, his expression one of almost priestly detachment. Finally, he said, "Describe your father's circle. Business associates, family, enemies, both acknowledged and secret. Mr. Goodwin will record them." She gave me the names, one by one, and I jotted them in my notebook. There was Howard Vance, an old partner with whom Gregory had severed ties years ago after a dispute about patents. A cousin, Philip Kincaid, who'd borrowed heavily and paid back slowly. A family friend, Dr. Lionel Marks, who had been Gregory's physician and bridge partner for 2 decades. And finally, Lydia Rayburn, Charles's wife, who had been unusually close to her father in recent months. That last one made Wolfe's eyes close in satisfaction. So, the jeweler's household is entwined. That explains his unease. Julia's hands twisted in her lap. "You don't think Charles himself—" "I think nothing yet," Wolfe cut her off. "But you will bring me the watch." Her breath caught. "You want me to—" "Yes," Wolfe said, firm enough to end the matter. "That object is the pivot of the case. Bring it here by tomorrow. Mr. Goodwin will escort you." She stood, clearly rattled but unwilling to argue. I walked her out, offered her a cab, and watched her disappear down the street before returning to the office. Wolfe had leaned back, eyes closed, fingers steepled. "Well?" I asked. "She has conviction," Wolfe said, almost to himself. "Whether it is truth or delusion remains to be seen. But note this, Archie. She was careful with her words. Too careful. She's holding something still. Tomorrow we will see whether it is the watch or her heart that betrays her." I left him to his beer and crossed to the kitchen where Fritz was fussing with an apple tart. Outside, traffic hummed and the city ticked on, every clock in every room keeping time. Only one had stopped, and it was waiting to tell us why. The next day began with a drizzle that slicked the sidewalks and gave the air a grey, metallic taste. I was halfway through my second cup of coffee when the bell rang again, sharp and insistent. Julia Kincaid stood on the stoop, clutching a small velvet case in both hands as if it were an infant. Her face was pale, but her jaw had that set I was beginning to recognize, determination mixed with dread. Inside the office, Wolfe greeted her with no more ceremony than a grunt. He gestured toward the red chair, and she sank into it, pressing the case into her lap. For a moment she just sat, staring at the floor, and I had the odd impression that she wanted the rug to swallow her whole rather than open what she carried. Finally, with a motion that seemed to cost her, she placed the case on Wolfe's desk and snapped it open. The watch was there, gold, heavy, its surface catching the lamplight in subdued glints. Even from across the room I could see that it had the kind of craftsmanship you'd expect to find in a museum rather than a pocket. But it was still, the hands frozen at 8:47. Wolfe didn't touch it. Of course he didn't. He leaned forward slightly, studying it as though his eyes alone could prize out its secrets. "When did you last wind it?" he asked. Julia shook her head. "I didn't. I haven't touched it since I found it. Yet it rests in this case. Who placed it there?" "I did," she admitted. "I couldn't bear to look at it lying on his desk, still and accusing." Wolfe's lips compressed. "Objects, Miss Kincaid, do not accuse. They signify, at best. You must resist sentiment if you wish to pursue truth." She flushed but didn't reply. I picked up the case, turning it slightly in my hands. The back had faint etchings, initials intertwined. GK and a date from 20 years ago. It had been a gift, clearly, and one with weight behind it. I could imagine a man like Gregory Kincaid treasuring it, winding it religiously, letting it mark out his days as faithfully as any calendar. Wolfe broke the silence. Archie, you will see Rayburn again. Ask him how he serviced this watch, what parts he adjusted, whether any opportunity existed for tampering. Julia's head snapped up. You think Charles? I think nothing, Wolfe said curtly. But your jeweler is now implicated by circumstance and by proximity. If he is innocent, facts will clear him. If not, they will condemn. Her hands tightened in her lap. And if it wasn't him? Then we proceed outward to your father's circle. You gave us names yesterday. Each will be examined. I shut the case and set it back down gently. You said your father mentioned pressure. Did he give you any hint? A letter? A remark about what they wanted? She hesitated, then spoke softly. He said only that it involved an old obligation, something from before I was born. He looked ashamed. That little morsel was enough to make Wolfe's brows lift, and trust me, that doesn't happen often. He tapped the arm of his chair once, decisively. An obligation. Very well. Miss Kincaid, you will leave the watch here. Mr. Goodwin will attend to your escorts as needed. Go now and await my summons. You will hear from me soon. She didn't argue. She rose, smoothed her skirt, and left with the quiet dignity of someone who has just relinquished more than an heirloom. When the door shut, Wolfe turned his gaze on me. Archie, he said, fetch Saul. That told me all I needed. Saul Panzer doesn't get called in unless Wolfe smells a nest of rats too wide for me to chase alone. I phoned Saul, gave him the bare bones, and arranged a meeting for later that evening. In the meantime, I headed to Madison to corner Rayburn at his shop. The jeweler's storefront was all polished glass and quiet elegance. Inside, Rayburn looked even more drawn than before, his skin as pale as the pearls displayed behind him. He nearly flinched when he saw me. Mr. Goodwin, he said tightly. Did Julia? She handed over the watch, I told him. And Wolfe wants to know exactly how you serviced it. He led me into a back room cluttered with magnifiers, tools, velvet-lined drawers. His hands shook slightly as he picked up a loop and a set of tiny screwdrivers. Routine cleaning. I replaced the mainspring, polished the gears, checked the escapement, nothing more. Anyone else handle it while it was here? No, he said firmly. My apprentices aren't allowed near pieces of that value. I logged every minute. I returned it myself on the morning of Mr. Kincaid's death. Then explain this, I said, opening my notebook. Why did Julia mention that your wife, Lydia, was unusually close to her father lately? The question hit him like a slap. His jaw tightened and a vein pulsed in his temple. Lydia admired Gregory, that's all. He was a man of presence. She sought advice from him occasionally. Advice? Said, letting my eyebrows do a little climbing. On jewelry or life? Rayburn's eyes narrowed. On investments. On matters I had little time for. If you're implying, I'm not implying anything, I said smoothly. But Wolfe doesn't like coincidences. A watch stops at a man's death and the jeweler's wife just happens to be close to him. He'll want clarity. Rayburn sank onto a stool, rubbing his face. You don't know Lydia. She can be impulsive, yes, but she would never harm Gregory. She thought of him almost as... He stopped short, realizing too late the word that had nearly slipped. Almost as what? I prodded. He shook his head violently. Enough. I'll not slander my wife or the dead. Tell Wolfe what I've told you. I've nothing to hide. Which, in my experience, usually meant he had at least a cupboard or two full of skeletons. I left him there, hunched over his tools, the clink of metal following me out. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe listened without comment until I reached the part about Lydia Rayburn. Then his lips curved in something that might have been a smile or indigestion. Interesting, he murmured. So the jeweler repairs time but cannot manage his own household. His wife sought counsel with Gregory Kincaid. That will bear fruit. Saul arrived at 7 sharp, as neat and nondescript as ever, which in his line of work was camouflage better than any disguise. Wolfe outlined the essentials, then gave him his tasks. Follow Vance, shadow Philip Kincaid, make discreet inquiries about Dr. Marks. Saul nodded, made a few notes, and was gone like smoke. When the house finally settled for the night, I poured myself a drink and leaned against the window, watching the drizzle streak the glass. The watch lay silent in its case on Wolfe's desk, hands frozen at 8:47, a mute witness daring us to catch up. Somewhere out there, someone knew why it had stopped, and I had the feeling we were getting closer, not to an answer, but to a fracture line, the kind that, once pressed, breaks everything open. By the next morning, Wolfe had already sequestered himself in the plant rooms, which meant the orchids were getting more of his attention than any client or corpse ever could. I let him be. You can't rush him. You just have to keep the machinery oiled until he's ready to pull the lever. My machinery involved strong coffee and a notebook of names Julia had dropped into our laps, each one a potential reason why a healthy man had dropped dead while his watch froze in sympathy. At 10 sharp, the phone rang. It was Saul, his voice low and clipped, as though he were reporting on the weather instead of human nature. Vance spends his evenings at a private club near Gramercy. Heavy poker games, heavy drinking. He lost more than he won last night and not in good humor about it. He mentioned Gregory Kincaid's name once, angrily. Something about still being cheated even, from the grave. That tidbit was enough to keep me from needing a second cup. Anything else? Philip Kincaid's habits are easier. He visited 2 banks yesterday, made withdrawals. Cash, large ones. That sort of money doesn't go into a birthday card. I'll keep on him. And the doctor? I asked. Dr. Marks is squeaky clean on the surface. He's in his office most of the day, then home. No detours. But I'll dig deeper. I thanked him and hung up, scribbling notes. When Wolfe finally descended, hours later, he carried the scent of damp earth and satisfaction. He sat, adjusted himself with a grunt, and demanded bear. Once Fritz had obliged, I gave Wolfe the rundown. His eyes closed as he listened, lids heavy but twitching faintly at each new morsel. Vance is bitter, he murmured. Bitterness without means is nothing. Philip with cash withdrawals is more suggestive, and a doctor without blemish. He let the sentence dangle like bait. You think the doctor's too clean? I asked. I think purity is a facade, but we shall see. Before I could needle him further, the bell rang again. Fritz answered, and moments later ushered in none other than Lydia Rayburn. She was younger than her husband by a decade, dark-haired, elegant, and carrying herself with the assurance of someone who expected rooms to adjust themselves around her. She didn't wait for an invitation. She walked in, glanced at Wolfe, then at me, and chose her chair as if she'd owned it all along. I understand, she said crisply, that Charles has involved you in an absurdity. That earned her a raised brow from Wolfe. Absurdity? This business with the watch, she said. My husband is nervous, excitable. He thinks shadows are conspiracies. Gregory Kincaid died of natural causes. To suggest otherwise is to insult his memory. Her tone was sharp enough to peel paint, but her eyes gave her away. They flicked to the desk, to the velvet case that still sat unopened where Wolfe had left it. She knew what was inside, and she feared it. You knew Gregory well, Wolfe said mildly. She stiffened. I respected him. Respected, Wolfe echoed. Your husband said you admired him, that you sought advice. Her lips tightened. Advice, yes. He was wise. He had lived long enough to see the world clearly. Charles resented it, but Gregory was a mentor to me. Pfui, Wolfe said, and it cracked her composure like a hammer on porcelain. She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a hiss. "You want the truth?" Gregory gave me hope. He listened when no one else would. He treated me as if I mattered, not as a decoration in Charles's shop. But I did not kill him, and I will not have my loyalty twisted into scandal. Wolfe's gaze was level, unyielding. "No one has accused you, madam. Not yet." Her breath caught, and for a moment she looked at me as if I might throw her a lifeline. But I stayed still, letting the silence choke the air until she rose abruptly. "Believe what you like," she snapped, "but leave me out of your theories. Gregory is gone, and nothing you do will bring him back." She swept out before I could open the door for her, the click of her heels on the marble hall sharp as a gunshot. When the door closed, I turned to Wolfe. "Well," she came in to shut us down and left the lid half off the box. She confirmed more than she denied. Wolfe said calmly, "Her attachment was not peripheral. That will matter." "Think Rayburn knows?" "Charles?" Wolfe's eyes opened, gleaming. "He suspects. That makes him vulnerable. Vulnerability invites manipulation." The rest of the day passed with the kind of taut waiting that only happens when pieces are shifting but not yet clicking. Saul phoned again near dusk. Vance, he said, had been overheard grumbling to a companion that Kincaid took what was mine and never paid. Philip Kincaid, meanwhile, had made another withdrawal, smaller this time, but furtive. Wolfe listened, then finally broke his stillness. "Archie, tomorrow you will bring them all, Vance, Philip, Lydia, Rayburn, the doctor, and Miss Kincaid. One by one, then together. This office will suffice as an arena." I sighed, and here I was hoping for a quiet weekend. "You will not have one," Wolfe said dryly. "Nor will they. The watch is bait. The guilty will bite." That night, as I lay in bed listening to the distant hum of the city, I thought about Lydia's eyes on the velvet case, about Philip sneaking cash, about Vance's bitterness curdling into rage. The watch ticked for none of them now, but I had the sense it was still keeping time, counting down to the moment Wolfe would spring the trap and let the whole mess unravel in his office, neat as a pocket square. By the time dawn rubbed the sleep out of its eyes, I was already prepping for what Wolfe had labeled an arena. That meant smoothing the office chairs into position, checking the angle of Wolfe's desk lamp, and making sure Fritz had something bracing on hand for the guests who would need it. You wouldn't think lighting and canapes mattered in the pursuit of truth, but in Wolfe's world, the setting was as crucial as the deductions. People broke faster when the room pressed in on them. The first to arrive was Howard Vance. He came in at 11, big-shouldered and sour-faced, with the permanent flush of a man whose veins were soaked in bourbon. His suit had been pressed recently, but you could see the creases of last night's poker game still hanging on him. I showed him to a chair, and he sat with the defiant slump of someone who already resents the questions he hasn't heard. Wolfe barely lifted his gaze. "Mr. Vance, you and Gregory Kincaid were partners once." "Years ago," Vance growled. "He cheated me out of what was mine." "Cheated?" Wolfe's eyebrows rose the barest fraction. "He claimed a patent that should have been joint, made a fortune, left me with scraps. I should have sued, should have fought. Instead, I drowned it. And now he's dead, so I suppose he won." The bitterness was genuine, thick as smoke. I studied him while he spoke. Anger can kill, but it rarely stages symbols. Wolfe let him vent, then dismissed him with a curt nod. "Remain available." Next came Philip Kincaid, lanky and pale, with the eyes of a man who slept with debts instead of pillows. He tried to smile on me as I ushered him in, but it cracked at the edges. Wolfe didn't waste time. "You have been making cash withdrawals," he said. "Why?" Philip flinched. "Personal matters." "Which?" He hesitated, then blurted, "Gambling. I owed men who don't accept excuses. My uncle, Gregory, helped me once. He refused again. I thought he might soften. He didn't. The confession hung in the air. He was desperate, yes, but desperation is messy, not precise. Wolfe's expression didn't change. "Remain available," he said, as though cataloguing another suspect on a shelf. Dr. Lionel Marks followed, silver-haired and steady, his demeanor calm enough to be carved from stone. He shook my hand with professional firmness before Wolfe spoke. "You were Mr. Kincaid's physician. Did you expect his death?" Marks frowned slightly. He had a strong heart. His passing surprised me. "But the coroner's report is clear. Natural failure. Bodies betray us without notice." "Did he speak to you of pressure?" Wolfe pressed. "No, not to me. Gregory was private." The doctor held Wolfe's gaze without flinching. Either he was clean, or he had the best poker face in Manhattan. Charles and Lydia Rayburn came together, though not quite side by side. She walked ahead, chin high, while he trailed, shoulders bent. Wolfe gestured them into separate chairs, and the space between them was louder than any quarrel. "Mr. Rayburn," Wolfe said, "your work on the watch was competent?" "Yes," Rayburn said quickly. "Meticulous." "And you, madam?" Wolfe turned his head toward Lydia. "Admired Mr. Kincaid." Her eyes flashed. "I respected him. I already told you." "Indeed. And yet you came yesterday to forestall inquiry. Why, if there is nothing to hide?" Her lips thinned. "Because gossip destroys reputations. Gregory deserves peace." Wolfe made a low sound, almost satisfaction, but said nothing more. He simply watched them until Charles began to fidget, then dismissed them as abruptly as the others. Finally, Julia Kincaid entered. She looked stronger this time, her grief tucked behind a shield of resolve. She acknowledged Wolfe with a nod, sat and folded her hands. "You have assembled them?" she asked softly. "Yes," Wolfe replied. "They will all return tomorrow afternoon together. Today is only for taste. Tomorrow will be the meal." Her brow furrowed. "And the watch?" "It remains here," Wolfe said. "It is safe, but safe does not mean silent. Its hands point at more than a time. They point at a truth. When they all sit in this room, it will speak." Julia shivered, though the room was warm. She rose, thanked Wolfe quietly, and left without further protest. When the door shut, Wolfe leaned back, closed his eyes, and steepled his fingers. "Archie," he said, "you will prepare invitations for tomorrow at 4. Everyone returns. Saul will be present. Fritz will provide coffee, and the watch will preside." I wrote it all down, though none of it needed recording. I could feel it, the weight of the trap coiling tighter, waiting for Wolfe to spring it. The suspects were circling, each with their grievances, their secrets, their flimsy alibis. But Wolfe had already seen the fracture lines. Tomorrow, they'd snap. That night, the brownstone was still, but my head wasn't. I kept thinking of Lydia's eyes darting to the case, of Philip's sweaty confession, of Vance's drunken bitterness, and of Julia's whispered old obligation. The watch sat on Wolfe's desk, its frozen hands unblinking, like a judge waiting for the gavel. And I knew, come tomorrow, Wolfe would bring it down. The next day wore its hours like a tight collar. Wolfe kept to his routine, orchids in the morning, a lunch that demanded Fritz's full orchestra of sauces, and then silence in the office while he stared at the ceiling as if the plasterwork might confess. I've seen him like that before, motionless except for the flicker of thought behind his eyelids. It meant he was threading the needle, waiting for the right moment to draw it through. By 3:30, I had the chairs arranged in the office, the long row facing Wolfe's desk, each one carefully angled so the occupants would have no choice but to look at him. Fritz set out a silver tray with coffee, though Wolfe would barely touch his own. It wasn't hospitality, it was bait. Offer a man a cup, watch his hands shake, and you learn more than a confession sometimes. The doorbell announced the parade. First came Vance, sullen and red-eyed, grumbling under his breath as if the cab driver had cheated him. Philip Kincaid trailed in next, pale and nervous, his collar wilted. Dr. Marks followed with measured steps, nodding politely but keeping his mouth shut. Charles Rayburn arrived alone, which meant Lydia was late, and when she finally swept in, she ignored her husband entirely. Julia was last, her composure intact, but her eyes dark with anticipation. I seated them, one by one, under Wolfe's watchful stare. When they were all settled, Wolfe cleared his throat. It wasn't loud, but it silenced the room better than any gavel. "You are here," he began, "because a watch stopped. A trifle, one might think. But trifles, in human affairs, are signals. Gregory Kincaid died while that watch ceased at 8:47. Symbolism, perhaps, or strategy." The room shifted. Philip coughed. Vance scowled. Lydia crossed her legs with deliberate elegance. Wolfe ignored them all. Each of you had reason to wish Mr. Kincaid ill. Mr. Vance, resentment over a lost fortune. Mr. Philip Kincaid, debts unpaid. Mrs. Rayburn, an attachment that may have exceeded propriety. Mr. Rayburn, a husband's jealousy. Dr. Marks, a physician's knowledge of frailty. And Miss Kincaid, a daughter's desire for truth, which may conceal a daughter's fear. The circle is complete. That stirred them as intended. Vance muttered a curse. Philip sputtered about unfairness. Lydia's eyes narrowed, while Charles's hands clenched on his knees. Julia simply sat straighter, as though bracing for impact. Wolfe let the murmurs die before continuing. "The watch is not magical. It did not halt itself. Someone tampered with it to mark the time of death, to impress upon others that Gregory Kincaid's end was no accident, that someone calculated both the act and the symbol." I opened the velvet case and set it on Wolfe's desk, the gold gleaming under the lamp. Every eye in the room followed it, and I noted whose gaze lingered longest. Lydia's lips parted just slightly, as though she wanted to speak but dared not. Wolfe pointed a finger, not at the watch, but at the group. "I will have answers. Each of you will account for yourself, here, now. Mr. Goodwin will manage the order." So I began. Vance blustered, repeating his grievances but insisting he wouldn't dirty his hands with anything beyond words. Philip stammered through his confession of debts, protesting he was too desperate and foolish to stage symbols. Marks kept his answers cool, stating medical facts and refusing to speculate. Charles Rayburn's voice trembled as he swore his innocence, but his eyes flicked toward Lydia more often than not. When it came to Lydia, the tension in the room coiled tighter. She leaned back, one elegant hand draped over the chair arm, and said, "I admired Gregory, yes, but I did not kill him, nor did I stop his watch. What purpose would it serve?" Her tone was poised, but her eyes betrayed a spark, half defiance, half defensiveness. Wolfe let the silence stretch until she shifted, a small betrayal, then turned his gaze on Julia. "Miss Kincaid, did your father ever confide who sought this old obligation?" Julia's voice was steady, but low. "No, only that it haunted him. He feared it would resurface." "Indeed," Wolfe murmured, "and resurface it has. Ladies and gentlemen, tomorrow evening you will return again. By then the matter will be settled. I will name the one who sought to clothe murder in the trappings of coincidence. Until then, go, leave this house." The uproar was immediate. Vance's curses, Philip's protests, Lydia's icy glare, Charles' sputters. I guided them out one by one until only Julia remained. She looked at Wolfe, searching, but he offered nothing more than a slight nod. When the door closed behind her, Wolfe finally exhaled, his eyes gleaming with the satisfaction of a trap nearing its spring. "Archie," he said, "fetch Saul. Tonight he will confirm what I already know." I didn't ask what that was. Wolfe never explained until he could crush his listeners with the weight of inevitability. But as I phoned Saul and arranged the meeting, I couldn't shake the feeling that the watch wasn't done ticking yet. Even if its hands hadn't moved in days, it was counting down to something, and tomorrow, in Wolfe's office, the hour would strike. Saul arrived just before 9 that night, punctual as the tides. He came in with his usual air of blending into the wallpaper, a quality that makes him both invisible and indispensable. Wolfe barely looked up from his chair when Saul settled into the seat across from me, but I could see the faint gleam of anticipation in Wolfe's eyes. He'd been sitting all day like a cat in front of a mouse hole. Now the whiskers were twitching. "Report," Wolfe commanded, in the tone of a general at roll call. Saul flipped open his notebook. "I put tails on 3 fronts. Vance drank himself half into oblivion again, this time at the Gramercy Club. Said plenty, most of it slurred, all of it bitter. No talk of watches, just old grudges. He's angry, but I don't think he's your precision man. He couldn't time his own shoes, let alone a symbolic gesture." Wolfe grunted. That was dismissal enough for Vance. "Philip Kincaid," Saul went on, "met with a man named Ralston, bookmaker, mid-level, cautious type." Philip handed him an envelope, and Ralston left smiling. The cash withdrawals weren't for fun. They were to keep his kneecaps unbroken. He's desperate, but he's not clever. He wouldn't risk turning his uncle's death into a circus when hiding is safer. Another grunt, this one quieter. Saul paused before his last point, and that told me it was the one Wolfe had been waiting for. "Lydia Rayburn paid a visit yesterday evening to Dr. Marks. She stayed 40 minutes, they argued. Neighbors overheard raised voices. Hers sharp, his calm. She left in a hurry. This morning she sent a note to him, delivered by hand. I intercepted a copy. It reads, 'If you won't stand by me, I'll tell them myself. I won't be made the scapegoat.'" That got Wolfe's full attention. His eyes snapped open and his hand flexed on the arm of his chair. "Excellent, Saul. You confirm what was already apparent. Lydia Rayburn is the axis." I sat up straighter. "You think she staged the whole thing?" "Not she alone," Wolfe said, his voice low but firm. "Her attachment to Gregory Kincaid was genuine, even intense. But symbols are not her métier. They are his." He jabbed a finger toward Saul's notes. "Dr. Marks, a physician, accustomed to calibrating lives to minutes, to declaring exact times. He is the one who would see to it that a watch stopped at death's moment. Lydia is his. Lever, he the hand." Saul closed his notebook, expression unreadable. "You want me to keep on them?" "No," Wolfe said. "We have enough. Tomorrow we will end this. All of them together, no escape. The watch will accuse them more eloquently than I could, and I will merely translate." Saul left without further word. Wolfe sat in silence, the office thick with it, until finally he spoke again, as if continuing a conversation only he had been having. "Archie, note this. To manipulate a symbol is to underestimate its power. Marx believed he could play with the trappings of fate and remain unseen. Tomorrow he will learn otherwise." I wrote it down, though Wolfe didn't need me to. He'd already carved it into stone in his mind. The rest of the night dragged with a tension you could feel in the walls. Fritz tried to lighten the mood with veal and cream sauce, but even that masterpiece couldn't soften Wolfe's taut stillness. He drank his beer, ate mechanically, and then retired early, leaving me with the company of the ticking clocks scattered around the brownstone. Each tick reminded me of the one that had stopped, and of the trap waiting to spring. I didn't sleep much. Around 2, I found myself staring out the window at the street below, deserted except for the occasional cab. Somewhere across town, Lydia Rayburn was pacing her bedroom, wondering what Dr. Marks would say. Marks himself was probably rehearsing calm denials in his mirror. Vance was drowning in whiskey. Philip was praying his debts wouldn't follow him into the daylight. Julia was waiting for a truth she half feared to hear. And Wolfe. Well, Wolfe was asleep, but his mind was already arranging tomorrow like a chessboard, one move from checkmate. When dawn finally broke, it was sharp and cold, the kind of morning that makes everything look too clear. The city went about its business, unaware that by the end of the day a truth would be dragged out of Harding and Wolfe's office, stripped bare by logic and pressure. I knew the drill. Wolfe would wait, motionless, until the suspects were seated again, and then he'd strike, not with fists, not with threats, but with words sharpened to blades. The watch, silent in its case, would be the gavel, and by nightfall, Wolfe would render judgment. By 4 o'clock the brownstone was set for battle. Fritz had outdone himself polishing the brass trim, as though the gleam might dazzle the guilty into confession, and I'd rearranged the chairs in Wolfe's office with military precision. Wolfe himself was already installed, massive and immovable, a mountain in his yellow chair. The velvet case with the watch sat closed on his desk, no ornament this time, but a presence, like a coiled snake in plain sight. The bell rang on schedule. Vance arrived first, reeking of whiskey, though he was dressed in his best suit, a poor disguise for a man who looked more used to losing than winning. Philip followed, visibly sweating, his tie loose and his eyes darting to the door as if he might bolt. Lydia Rayburn swept in after, impeccable as ever, her calm stretched too thin over whatever storm she carried inside. Charles trudged behind her, weary and resigned, the shadow to her flame. Dr. Marks entered with quiet dignity, his eyes sharp but his face unreadable. Julia was last, her step hesitant but resolute, the lone figure in the room with nothing to hide, at least nothing that Wolfe hadn't already spotted. I closed the door behind them, the click echoing like a verdict. Wolfe opened his eyes and let them rest on the assembled faces, one by one, until the room was still. "You're here," he said, "because Gregory Kincaid's death was not merely an act of nature, but an act of will. The watch," he gestured toward the case, "was tampered with to mark his passing, a deliberate symbol meant to shape perception. Whoever set it intended to suggest fate while concealing design. That intent unmasks them." Lydia's chin lifted. "You presume too much. Gregory's heart failed. The watch—" "Phooey," Wolfe cut her off, his tone slicing the air. "The watch was not coincidence. It was calculation, and calculation requires a calculating mind. One among you supplied it." Vance growled. "I've said it before. I hated the man, but I didn't kill him." "Indeed," Wolfe said smoothly. "Your hatred is volcanic, Mr. Vance. Crude, noisy, but not subtle. To stop a watch at the moment of death requires timing, precision, and above all, purpose beyond spite. You lacked both capacity and subtlety." Philip squirmed in his chair. "I needed money, yes. But murder? No, I begged him for help. Killing him would have buried me deeper." "Precisely," Wolfe agreed. "You are desperate, but desperation does not wield artistry. The watch was artistry, and you, sir, are no artist." Dr. Marks folded his hands. "If you are implying I tampered with a timepiece, you overestimate my interest in horology. My concern was Gregory's health, nothing more." "Health?" Wolfe's eyes gleamed. "A physician knows better than any man how death can be explained away. You examined him, declared him strong, yet he died within days. And the watch, the watch. Who else would think to mark time so theatrically? Who else lives by minutes, by precision, by symbols that decide life or death? It was you who orchestrated this farce." The silence cracked with Lydia's gasp. She sprang to her feet, eyes blazing. "No, he didn't. If anyone—" She stopped, biting her lip too late. The slip had been made. Wolfe's voice was soft, but relentless. "You were his lever, Mrs. Rayburn. Your admiration for Gregory was more than passing. You confided in Marks, and he saw opportunity. To remove Gregory was to free you, and to indulge his vanity. A perfect symbol, a watch that stops at the moment of death. But it was too perfect. Symbols betray their makers." Marks stood, his composure straining at the edges. "This is outrageous. You have no proof." "No proof?" Wolfe's tone sharpened. "You quarreled with Lydia when she grew fearful. She threatened to confess. She knew the plan had gone too far. And you, Doctor, you counted on your authority to silence doubt. But you misjudged the watch. You made it speak louder than your credentials. That is your proof." Lydia's hands shook. "I never meant—" She broke off, eyes darting between Marks and Wolfe, as though realizing at last that silence was no longer an option. Marks's mask slipped just slightly, enough for me to see the fury underneath. But Wolfe leaned forward, sealing the matter with words heavy as stone. "You tampered with the watch, Dr. Marks, to mark the time of a death you abetted. Whether by withheld treatment or by subtle means, you ensured Gregory Kincaid's heart ceased when it did. You turned death into spectacle. And now, spectacle unmasks you." The room erupted, Julia sobbing quietly, Philip muttering prayers, Vance swearing, Charles staring at Lydia as though seeing her for the first time. Lydia herself crumpled into her chair, trembling, while Mark's denial came too late, too hollow. I stood ready by the phone, knowing Wolfe would want Inspector Kramer brought into the loop before long. But in that moment, Wolfe closed his eyes again, as if already dismissing the chaos around him. The watch lay silent in its case, its frozen hands bearing witness, while Wolfe sat back in his chair, the architect of another ruin, revealed without moving more than a finger. The room held its breath after Wolfe's pronouncement, though in reality it was only the suspects who seemed short on air. I could hear Julia's muffled sobs, Vance's muttering curses, Philip's shallow panting. Lydia sat rigid, white-knuckled, staring down at her lap, while Charles looked as if he had aged 20 years in a blink. Marks was the only one who tried to maintain control, but I could see the small betrayals, the twitch of a jaw muscle, the bead of sweat at his temple. Wolfe didn't open his eyes, letting the silence draw itself into a vice. He didn't have to. The silence was his accomplice, and it worked cheaper than Saul Panzer. Marks finally broke. His voice was measured, though the cracks in it were widening. "You are spinning theatrics, Wolfe. A watch, a few suspicions, and suddenly you name me a murderer. It won't hold." Wolfe shifted, opening his eyes, and the weight of them pinned Marks to the chair. "It will hold, because it explains everything too neatly to be chance. You tampered with the watch not for them, not for Julia, or for Rayburn, or even for Lydia. You did it for yourself, to prove you could turn death into metaphor and remain unseen. That vanity is your undoing." Marks tried a smile, thin as paper. "If you believe that, summon the police. Let them waste their time with your conjectures. They will find no poison, no weapon, no proof beyond your words." "Archie," Wolfe said without shifting his gaze. "The phone." That was my cue. I crossed the room and lifted the receiver, already dialing Inspector Kramer's number by memory. Julia turned toward me with wide, tear-bright eyes, as if the sound of the rotary was more final than Wolfe's words. Lydia snapped then, her voice breaking as she lurched forward. "Stop! Don't you see? It wasn't murder. It wasn't meant to be. Gregory was iller than he admitted. Lionel told me he was near collapse. He only let it happen. He said it was merciful." Her confession spilled out like water through a cracked dam. Charles flinched as though struck, his head sinking into his hands. Julia froze, her sobs cut short, staring at Lydia with horror and disbelief. Marks closed his eyes, but not in serenity, more in resignation. Wolfe remained steady, his tone almost gentle. "Mercy is not yours to grant, Mrs. Rayburn, nor yours, Doctor. You conspired in silence, and then you sought to dress the silence in symbols. That is not mercy. It is arrogance." Kramer's voice barked through the line as he picked up. I relayed Wolfe's request for his presence. Shorthand style, giving just enough detail to rattle his cage. He promised to be over in 20 minutes, with men. When I hung up, Wolfe was already leaning back, eyes closed, the case dismissed in his mind, though the room still heaved with tension. Julia rose suddenly, her voice steady, though her hands shook. "So it's true. You let him die. You turned my father into your experiment." She looked at Marks with a fury that might have burned him alive if words could. "And you—" Her gaze cut to Lydia, who shrank against the chair. "You called it mercy, but it was theft. You stole his last chance to live, and then you mocked him with that watch." Philip mumbled something that sounded like a prayer, though no one listened. Vance snorted, half in disgust, half in grim satisfaction. Charles sat hollow, staring at nothing, the ruin of his marriage written plain on his face. When the bell rang and Kramer thundered in with 2 plainclothes men, the spell snapped. Mark stood, his composure returned for a moment, and held out his hands with a doctor's dignity. "I'll cooperate. You'll find nothing." Kramer gave him a look that could peel bark off a tree. "We'll see what we find. Wolfe, if this is another one of your damn parlor games." "It is not," Wolfe said evenly, still seated, still immovable. "You will search, you will test, and you will see the pattern is unmistakable." Kramer growled something unprintable, but he signaled his men, and they took Marks into custody. Lydia followed, protesting faintly, though no one gave her the courtesy of listening. Philip was escorted out after, still trembling, and Vance left with a bitter laugh, muttering about justice coming too late. Julia lingered a moment longer, standing by the desk, staring down at the velvet case as if the watch might speak one last time. "Thank you," she said finally, her voice a thread of steel through the grief, "for seeing what I could not." Wolfe inclined his head, nothing more, and she left. The office was suddenly cavernous in its quiet. I closed the door behind her and turned back to Wolfe, who had already reached for his beer. "Well," I said, sinking into a chair, "that's one watch that won't be ticking again." Wolfe took a long swallow, then set the glass down. It served its purpose. Time is inexorable, Archie. Men may attempt to halt it, to mark it, to twist it into symbols, but time is indifferent. Only truth endures. He closed his eyes, signaling the end of the discussion. The watch remained on the desk, still and golden, hands frozen at 8:47. Outside, the city's clocks ticked on, heedless of the man who had thought he could command them. Inside, silence returned to the brownstone, broken only by the faint clink of glass as Wolfe raised his beer again. And that, as always, was the end of it. A case unraveled by words, not fists, a judgment rendered without leaving his chair, and dinner waiting in the kitchen while the world outside kept its own relentless time. The brownstone was quiet again by the time Kramer and his men had gone. Fritz had retreated to the kitchen where the clink of pans promised something restorative, and Saul had vanished as silently as he'd come. Only Wolfe and I remained in the office, the velvet case still on the desk, the watch inside a relic of arrogance. I leaned back, loosening my tie. Well, that was one for the books. A doctor with a god complex, a jeweler's wife with a wandering heart, a nephew who can't keep his pockets from leaking, and a bitter ex-partner drowning in rye. Not exactly a shortage of motives, but it took your brain to sort the noise from the music. Wolfe's eyes were closed, but I knew he wasn't asleep. Noise is constant, Archie. Men thrive on it, amplify it, drown themselves in it. But music, pattern, appears only when one listens without sentiment. Marx believed he could compose fate itself, and in so doing, revealed the discord in his own vanity. "That's one way to put it," I said. "Another is that he thought he was clever enough to play puppeteer and you cut the strings before he could take a bow." He grunted, which was as close to agreement as I was going to get. The watch was never a symbol of fate. It was merely a tool, employed clumsily. Symbols are dangerous things, Archie, because they speak louder than words to those who wish to hear them. But in truth, it was silence that condemned him. The silence of a physician who withheld, the silence of a woman complicit by affection, the silence of those too timid to speak until forced. He reached for his beer, lifting it with the deliberation of a toast. And silence in this house is only broken when truth demands it. I let him sip in peace, then got to my feet. Speaking of truth, Fritz has been waiting with that roast duck you made him promise to serve tonight. If we don't get to the table soon, he'll call it a crime against gastronomy, and you'll have another investigation on your hands. Wolfe opened his eyes long enough to glare at me, but there was no heat in it. Pfui! Go, Archie. I will follow. I left him there with the watch, knowing he'd bring it upstairs to the safe later, filed away among other curiosities of human folly. By the time we sat down to dinner, the case was already receding into memory, another knot untangled without Wolfe ever leaving his chair. And as I carved my share of duck, I thought about Julia, who would carry the burden of truth longer than any of us, about Lydia, who had lost both her illusions and her freedom, and about Gregory Kincaid, whose life had ended in silence while the city's clocks ticked on. But in the brownstone, all was steady again. Justice had been served, beer was cold, and dinner was hot. And if you ask me, that's about as good an ending as anyone gets in this city. One 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 gets in this city.